Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're on lesson 22, chapter 22, which is all about using JavaScript variables, JavaScript strings, and JavaScript arrays. What we're going to learn in this lesson is how to name, declare, and assign variables. We're going to learn how to choose whether to use a local or a global variable, how to convert between different data types, how to create and use string objects, how to create and use arrays of numbers, and arrays of strings. We're going to learn how to define, call, and return values from functions. We're going to learn how to use object properties and values, how to define and use object methods. We're going to learn how to use the math objects methods. We're going to learn how to use new and this keywords to work with objects. And we're going to learn how to use the date object to work with dates. Now that we've already learned some of the fundamentals of JavaScript and the DOM, this lesson is going to dig deeper into the more details of the JavaScript language and what we can do. So at this point, we've already used variables a few times in some of our lessons. We're going to go over a little bit more about variables, such as choosing a variable name. Variables are name containers that can store data, such as a number, a string, or a text, or an object, and every variable has a unique name of your choosing. But there are rules you must follow when creating variable names. They can include letters of the alphabet, upper and lowercase, and they can also include the digits 0 through 9 and the underscore character. They cannot include spaces or any other punctuation. The first character of the variable must be either a letter or an underscore. Variable names are case sensitive, and if you use a different capital or lowercase, if it's the same word, they're interpreted as separate variables. There's no official limit on the length, but it must fit on one line. If your variable names are longer than, say, 25 characters, you might consider a different naming convention. So using these rules, it shows you an example of a list of variable names that are valid in chapter 22 at the beginning. I'm going to talk about the difference between a local variable and a global variable. Before we do that, though, we need to understand scope. A variable scope is the area of the script in which the variable can be used. So a global variable, they have the entire script as their scope. They can be used anywhere, even within functions. Local variables have a single function as their scope. They can be used only within the function they are created in. So to create a global variable, you declare it in the main script outside any functions, and then you can use the var keyword to declare the variable, and it shows you an example of this in the book. A local variable belongs to a particular function. Any variable you declare with the var keyword in a function is a local variable. In addition, the variables in the function's parameter list are always local variables. Your book then goes through and talks about assigning values to variables. You can use an equal sign to assign a value to a variable, and then it talks about some other syntax of expressions and operators. The addition symbol can be used to add or concatenate or combine strings. You can do basic math like plus, minus, multiplication, divide. It talks about operator precedence, order of operations, different data types, which we'll go over a little bit. There's numbers. JavaScript supports integers and floating point numbers. There's booleans. Booleans are logical values, and it can have one of two values, true or false, and it's useful for indicating whether a certain condition is true. A lot of programmers use boolean. A string consists of one or more characters of text, and we'll learn about later in this lesson. Null, the null value, represented by the keyword null, is the value of an undefined variable. You can also convert between data types. In some situations, you might end up with a string containing a number, and you need to convert it to a regular numeric value. JavaScript includes two functions for this purpose, parseInt and parseFloat. ParseInt converts a string to an integer number, parseFloat converts a string to a floating point number. Next, your book goes into talking about string objects. We've already used several strings before in some other JavaScript examples, and strings store a group of text characters and are named similarly to other variables. So we should know that JavaScript stores strings as objects. Remember when we talked about objects in previous lessons? So you really don't need to worry about this piece of information. You need to just kind of understand that your strings are in fact objects, which use methods or built-in functions of the string object. There are two ways to create a string object. The first one we've already used, and the second one involves object-oriented syntax. So you can do var string test equals and then set it to equal to a string, or you can do string test equals new string and then set the string in parentheses. The second statement uses that new keyword, which is used to create objects, and it tells the browser to create a new string object containing the text and assigns it to the variable string test. The book gives you an example of assigning values to strings and combining them. So work through that example. It's really helpful. You can also calculate the length of a string. You might find it useful to know how many characters a string variable contains. You can do this with the length property of string objects. To use this property, type the string's name followed by .length. So if you want to check the length of a string with the variable named string test, you do string test.length, and it refers to the length of the string test string, and it shows you an example of this in your book. You can also convert the case of a string. There's two methods of the string object enable you to convert the contents of a string either to all uppercase or all lowercase. And they are like they sound. The method is to uppercase and the method is to lowercase. Next, the chapter talks about using numeric arrays. An array is a numbered group of data items that you can treat as a single unit. For example, you might use an array called scores to store several scores for a game. Arrays can contain strings, numbers, objects, or other types of data, and each item in an array is called an element of the array. So you can create a numeric array in a few different ways, and your book shows you how to declare array and then assign it values, and then how to do all this in one line, and then it shows you another shorthand property. Just like strings, arrays have a length property. This property tells the number of elements in the array. If you specify the length when creating the array, the value becomes the length property's value. So if you say scores equals new array 30, which is the length, scores.length will be 30. JavaScript also includes a sort method for arrays. Remember, a string is a string object, an array is an array object. So this sort method of an array object returns an alphabetically sorted version of an array. So if you have an array of names and you call .sort method on that array, it will sort them alphabetically. And next, it goes through talking about functions. A function is a group of JavaScript statements that can be treated as a single unit. To use a function, you must define it. Your book gives you an example of a simple function such as greet. When you call that function greet and feed it a parameter, it will add an alert with the text of that parameter. To call the function, use the function name as a statement in a script or as an action associated with an event. And then you need to include the parentheses and the value for the function's parameters if there's any. Your book gives you an example of a complete function and calling the function. The chapter then goes through and talks about objects, such as DOM objects, built-in objects, how to create objects, understanding methods, and using objects to simplify scripting. So JavaScript variables and arrays provide versatile ways to store data. Sometimes you need a more complicated structure, which is when objects become useful. Suppose you're creating a script to work with a business card database that contains names, addresses, and phone numbers for various people. If you were using regular variables, you would need to create separate variables for each person in the database, a name variable, an address variable, and so on, which would be really confusing. Arrays would improve things a little bit. You can have a names array and an address array and a phone number array, but each person in that database would have an entry in each array. So it's still not perfect. With objects, you can make the variables that store the database as logical as the physical business cards they are supposed to represent. Each person would be represented by a new card object, which can contain properties for a name, address, and phone number. And you can even add methods to the object to display or work with the information. So this is the real key feature to using objects and why we would use objects. The book goes through an example of using JavaScript to create a card object and some properties and methods that you can use for that card. So think of it just like a business card. You have a name, address, phone number. We'll see that it's really tedious to do this with just variables. It's a little better to do it with arrays, but then there's multiple arrays for each person. So by creating an object, we can have this card object, and properties and methods can be used on that card object. Each person would be an instance of that card object. Your book goes through a step-by-step way to define an object, and then to define an object method, and then create an object instance. And like I said, each person is an instance of the card object. And then it goes through a simple script that uses the card object. So I would highly recommend, if you tried any examples in this whole chapter, to try this one. This is probably the most important one that you're going to work with in this chapter. And this is, it shows you the HTML code, the JavaScript code, to use a card object example to print out the names of these cards. And then it goes through and talks about in your chapter on extending on built-in objects. So adding methods to string objects, using the math object. The math object has a bunch of built-in methods to round numbers, generating random numbers, and there's other methods, and the book gives you an example of working with the math methods. And then finally it ends with talking about dates. There's a date object that's built in with JavaScript that enables you to work easily with dates and time. You can create a date object anytime you need to store a date and use the date object methods to work with the date. The book goes through and shows you how to create the date object, setting date values, reading date values, and then working with different time zones. You can also convert between different date formats. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen and show you some examples of working with arrays, functions, and objects. In this first example, called string text, we're going to show you how strings work. We're creating a variable, string test1, and we're setting it to this is a test. We're creating another string variable, this is only a test, and we're going to say var both strings, another variable, is equal to string test1 plus string test2, so it's going to add both of these. And then we're going to make an alert, it's going to display both strings. So let's see what happens when we load the page. It gives us an alert that says this is a test, this is only a test. So it gives us an alert and it concatenates both strings. This is the first string, and this is the second string. Next example, sorting string arrays, or how to sort an array. So here we're taking some input, you can enter 2 or more names in the field below, and the sorted list of names will appear in the text area. So if I enter Brad, it adds here. If I enter Fred, it will add. Notice how it's arranging them in alphabetical order. So how is this doing this? Well, let's first look at what happens. We're adding text in here, and then we're clicking the add button. So we have everything in between our form tags, which is our input. Then we have the input of new name, type button, add name, value, and then we're calling sort names when we click add. This is our text area where the sorted names will display. Notice how the JavaScript was separate. It was a separate file. I just combined it for this example, but you should make your JavaScript an external file. So let's look at what's actually happening after we click add, which calls sort names. First, we're initializing the counter and the array. We have number of names, which starts off with 0, and then we have names equals new array. So we're creating an array of names. When the function sort names is called, get the name from the text field. So we're saying the name equals document.theform.newName.value. So whatever the user inputs here, we're getting the value. When I first inputted Brad, it's getting the value of that when I click add, which calls sort names. We're then adding the name to the array. So we're saying names, number names, which is 0 right now, equals the name, which is the name Brad that I just put in. And we're going to increment the counter. So number names is now going to be set to 1 because there's one name in there. Then we're going to sort the array. We're going to say names.sort, which calls this sort built-in method. And we're saying document.theform.sorted.value equals names.join. And we're going to make it go on a new line. So the next time you add something, number names is now going to be the value 1. So it's going to add a new name in the first position, which is actually the second. Remember, it starts at 0. So 0, then 1, and it's going to add each name and then sort them. Next example, functions. So let's say we have these 2 buttons here. I am Fred, I am Ethel. On click, it's going to call this greet function, right? It's going to call this greet function with the parameter of Fred, or call this greet function with the parameter of Ethel. So when this function is called, given this parameter, we're saying alert greetings plus who, which is whatever the user enters there, plus the exclamation point, which in this case, when this button is clicked, the parameter that is given is Fred, and when this button is clicked, the parameter that is given is Ethel. So if I click this, it says greetings Fred. If I click this, it says greetings Ethel. Let's look at another function example. This is taking an average. So right here, we're creating this function called average that takes in 1, 2, 3, 4 parameters. The result of this function will be a plus b plus c plus d, those 4 numbers, and then divided by 4. And then it will return the result, which is the result of the 4 numbers divided by 4. So here, this is just the HTML that we're familiar with. In our script tags here, we're saying score equals average, so we're calling this function, and we're giving it 3, 4, 5, and 6. So when we call this function average, it's going to take this with the numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's going to say result is equal to 3 plus 4 is 7, plus 5 is 12, plus 6 is 18, and then it's going to divide that by 4. So we have 18 divided by 4, and it's going to say document.write, the average is, plus score, which will be the result. So we're saying the average is 4.5. If we change these numbers here, I say 7, reload the page, now it's 5.5. Next example is working with objects. We are creating JavaScript business cards. Notice our HTML is just pretty much the title, the header, and script output coming up. Everything between here is generated by JavaScript. So let's look at what's happening. First, we're defining functions called print card. And notice we're having name line, email line, address line, phone line, and we're setting those variables equal to, and we're actually using the HTML. But there we're saying this dot name, and then we're saying document.write, name line, email line, address line, phone line. So that's what happens when you call the function print card. Then we have this function card, name, email, address, phone. This dot name equals name, this dot email equals email, etc. Then we create the objects. Sue, we're saying new card object, and we're giving it the values. First one is name, second one's email, then address, then phone number. We're creating another one for Fred, another one for Jimbo, and then we're going to print them. So we're going to call Sue.printCard, Fred.printCard, and Jimbo.printCard. And it's going to print these like this. Next, we have method to string object. So testing of a heading method. So you have this function, add heading. We're saying h plus level, so whatever the number is, 1 through 6, and text equals this.toString. Then we're giving it an open tag, closing tag. We're adding the HTML, which is the h plus the number in the center. So it's pretty much like we're creating the header h1, h2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 tags right here in this function. And the string.prototype.heading equals add heading. So if we say document.write, this is a heading 1, and we say heading 1, it will display this. This will display heading 2. Notice there's no HTML right here. This is all done with JavaScript. So if I go here and say heading 4, what is being displayed, and then this is just affecting the size, which is the HTML tags. So if I reload, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's actually writing HTML. And lastly, we have a random number math example. So here we could check how random are JavaScript's random numbers. So we're going to generate 5,000 of them and find out and take the average. Now remember, the math.random generates a number between 0 and 1, a random number. So we're using our for loop, and we're going to loop through 5,000 numbers, and we're going to say num equals math.random, which gives us a random number between 0 and 1, and then total plus equal num. So if I mod 1,000 equals 0, which meaning for every 1,000, we're going to say document.write generated plus I numbers. So at 1,000, then 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And then we're saying the average equals the total divided by 5,000. So average equals math.round, average times 1,000 divided by 1,000. And then we're going to say document.write, h2 average of 5,000 numbers is, add this average. So if we do this 5,000 times, we see that generate 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, and the average of 5,000 numbers is 0.501. If we do it again, we'll get a little bit of a different average because it's taking 5,000 random numbers and then finding the average. And we can also set this to say, just do 50,000. Change this to 50, save. Now it's going to show a lot more of these because every 1,000 number is going to print out. The more random numbers we do, the closer it's going to be to 0.5 because we're averaging out 50,000 random numbers now. So that's how you use math.random and a for loop to iterate through thousands of random numbers and get the average and use JavaScript for that and display it on the page. Okay, I hope those examples helped. Coming up next, we have our Lesson 22 PowerPoint presentation, so stay tuned.